and welcome to Building Futures, career conversations with leading lights across the built environment. Today I'm joined by Stephen Marcos-Jones, who is the CEO of the Association for Consulting Engineering. Hello, Stephen.
Hi.
So can you just tell me a little bit about your current job, please?
Yeah, so I am the CEO of the Association for Consulting and Engineering, as you kindly introduced me. So we are advocates on behalf of the infrastructure sector, the built environment sector in the UK. So we lobby government, we advocate on behalf of the sector, we seek the best policy environment for our sector to be prosperous and to grow.
Fantastic. So when people listen to this, what I often get feedback on is they love to know about people's journeys and what has got them to this stage. So you've got this really prestigious job. Where did it start? So you went to university. What was the journey between uni and where you are now?
Okay, so I'm a linguist, so that's, if you ask me what my kind of special subject would be, it's languages. So I studied languages at university, modern and medieval languages. And a lot of people that study that go into all kinds of careers. Some of them become teachers, some of them become translators. For me though, I thought, well, how do I link this into the right business environment? And I thought, well, what's common across all the languages? Well, it's communication. So I took that as my starting block. I thought, right, communication is probably the first area I'm going to explore. I left Oxford University and I went to Spain. I'm half Spanish, went to Barcelona, and I joined an organisation called the European Group for Blood and Marrow Transplantation, knowing absolutely nothing about stem cell transplantation or blood transplantation. Did it matter? No, it didn't matter at all, because what I was coming in to do was communicate on behalf of that expert community. So that's where I started out. I built a communications team for the organisation that had been around for, I think, 50 years even at that point. But it was a bit of an echo chamber of a sector. You know, they were very good at, you know, knowing each other and sharing science, but the science wasn't getting out there. It wasn't getting out to the patients. Nobody was really cited on what these scientists were exploring. So my job was to kind of bring that message out to a different audience. So I did that for a number of years. I then got to a point, I think after year 4 or 5, where I thought, you know, what am I going to do next? And I thought, well, I'm going to come back to London. And see. I was always opposed to working in London. I was never kind of keen to sell my soul to the city, as it were. You know, big companies would come to the university and they try and coax you to join them at an early age out of university, and I was never going to do that, I thought. But anyway, we said let's move back to the UK, give it a go. There's more career opportunity in the UK than there is in Southern Europe. So I came back and I thought, right, communications, I'm going to keep going down that track. And a role came up for the National Centre for Languages. I thought, fantastic. And it was a membership body. My previous organisation was a membership body. And so I thought, right, it's Department for Education run. Is it going to be a bit of a strange culture to go into? But no, it wasn't. It was actually, again, another really exciting context. It ticked the box for languages, it ticked the box for communication, stakeholder management, all of those things that I've been honing over the previous 4 years. And I did that for, I think, 18 months, and then the funding was pulled by government. So I was, you know, in that awful situation, I thought, I've moved back to the UK. What am I going to do? The job that I thought I was going to have for a number of years has suddenly evaporated. And it was at that point, again, I thought, well, you know, which avenue do I want to go down? Yeah. And I stopped again and I thought, well, what are the skills that I've built up over this period of time? And I came back to, obviously had the comms, it was then the membership. It was packaging a value proposition. I'd learnt how to do it. And I joined the oil and gas sector, which for me was a massive surprise, and for my friends was a massive surprise. And it meant going from effectively the sunshine of Spain to Aberdeen.
And, the sunshine of Aberdeen.
The sunshine of Aberdeen.
All 3 days?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Granite City. Yeah. And I moved up there. and I started off in a membership role, and it was about growing the representative voice of the association from just the operators, the BPs and Shells of this world, to the broader supply chain. And I thought, well, you know, can I make a success of this, or am I going to absolutely hate the sector? And I absolutely loved it, because Aberdeen is a village. The sector is a village where you've got these sectors that perhaps aren't as welcomed or celebrated as perhaps the scientific community that I was once in Barcelona. You know, people get to know each other. It actually becomes quite a warm and welcoming place. But I was working with engineers, and I hadn't worked with engineers before, and I wasn't one of them. And I thought, this is going to be very difficult. And in fact, you know, when I started out in oil and gas, the things that I would always notice was, well, you're not an engineer. How can you represent us to government if you're not an engineer? But you haven't been doing a very good job at representing yourselves, because you just know your own engineer speak. You're not able to market yourselves as effectively as you need to in order to demonstrate your kind of value to the UK, to policymakers, to encourage them to implement the changes you want them to implement so that the sector can thrive. So I actually found a strength in being different. Yeah. I found a strength in not being an engineer. And yeah, that's kind of where my career in advocacy started. It was having a different viewpoint on a topic from the specialists that were working in that topic. And we grew the organisation over a number of years. We engaged the supply chain, which was the primary objective. We had some massive wins with government in terms of, you know, supporting Aberdeen City, in terms of ensuring that policy encouraged companies to continue to invest in the UK. But it then started to get tougher and tougher. The advent of net zero. Yes. Decarbonisation wasn't even thought of. Decarbonisation was just something that happened when you closed down or one of the assets came to the end of their lives. It was about decommissioning, decarbonising. So the pressure from government, and quite rightly so, and society became huge on the oil and gas sector. And what went from being, you know, a very kind of constructive advocacy, quite a friendly relationship with government, became very difficult. And we had to become very defensive in a way in order to explain why you couldn't just switch from oil and gas to renewables overnight. But perhaps government, as government is, took things to the extreme and started shutting the industry out of certain conversations, didn't want industry around the table. So, you know, it became quite a challenging environment to do advocacy in.
But often we learn the most in those most challenging moments, don't we? I think often we don't reflect as much when things are going well. We don't take that moment, do we? But when things are harder, often you can look back and go, but I learnt the most in that moment because I was put in a situation that it stretched me. Yeah. So I had to learn some new skills. When you go look back on that, what skills do you look back on and say, well, that's what I learnt in that moment in my career that was more challenging?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing I learnt was that when you do successful advocacy, you've got to see things from the other point of view. And so I had to go to government and say, you need this sector, but how do you want us to cast our story? How do you want to work with us? And then bringing that to my members at that point, my stakeholders, and saying, okay, this is the only way we're going to be listened to. This is the only way we're going to be heard. And I suppose I can make a great link here. It was translation. Yeah. And I go back to what I studied. So it was translating one message to a different stakeholder in a different way so that they understood it.
Yeah, and also I guess it's with your arts background, it's often summarising it, isn't it? Lots and lots of different opinions and trying to bring it into actually quite a simple message that can be understood and then that is actionable. Because that's ultimately, you want to see that something has happened because of something you've said. So what's the link then, or what moment did you think, right, I'm ready for another change?
So I think after quite a few years in the oil and gas sector, I decided that I wanted to take my skills elsewhere. And I'd become quite a well-known individual in the oil and gas sector, and I liked that. People do like that. I'd walk down the high street in Aberdeen and people would say hello. That kind of village kind of feel that I mentioned earlier. But I thought, I've got to see where I can take these skills elsewhere. There's got to be a sector where the advocacy is perhaps less defensive. So what I did was I again, like I had done previously in my career, I sat down and I thought, okay, what are these transferable skills that I have? Are they still contextually agnostic? Can I take them into whatever sphere, whatever industry, and do the same thing? Or had I become wedded to a specific sector? I was wearing the oil and gas t-shirt and I wouldn't ever be able to change it. So one of the things when you consider a change later on in your career is the impact it has on your kind of, your broader setup, the responsibilities that grow as you move through life. So that flirting with that idea of change for me, had greater ramifications than perhaps when I was in my early 20s. But I sat down and I thought, well, actually, let's quantify these risks. It's all about growing in your career. It's all about having that sense of purpose. It's all about feeling that you're making a difference. And that overrode, for me at that point, the stability that I'd built up in the oil and gas sector. And I thought, well, I can actually take what I've learned again into a different sector where perhaps, government is more amenable, government wants to work with you. Infrastructure in oil and gas isn't so different, but they are on different sides of the party line, as it were.
So I'm fascinated by this because effectively what we're talking about is changing career. And lots of people, particularly I think as the younger generation that's coming up, as they are going to have to work, they're going to live a lot longer, which is fantastic, but they're also therefore going to have to work a lot longer to afford their own, effectively, retirements later in life. So we know that they'll probably have 50, 60-year careers, and these are the people, our children's generation now. So I'm fascinated by career change, a slight sense of change of direction. So can we just go back a bit and talk about that change? You said that you thought about what careers that were you said the skills that were almost sector agnostic. How did that actually happen? Did you sit with a piece of paper and go, I'm fascinated by this? Did you write down? Did you almost talk it through with a friend or a mentor? Did you just go for a walk and it came to you?
That's a really interesting question. So obviously your internal monologue sorts some of this out.
Yeah.
But I think what struck me most is when you start to look at other job descriptions, and what I've noticed over time is that must have 15 years of experience in this sector has started to disappear.
Yes.
And that's great.
Yes.
And that's what companies need to do more of.
Amen.
So as I worked through job descriptions, I thought, well, I can do that. I can do this. I can do that. And I suppose I started kind of listing out examples of where I could demonstrate where I could do these different tasks that they were seeking. So it was all about just looking for that synergy, I suppose, in the skills that I'd grown elsewhere and where I was, encouraged to perhaps apply.
And I think that's a really good takeaway for any employers who are listening to this, either video or the podcast, is that actually we know that a lot of people are put off applying for certain jobs if it's too prescriptive. And yet, as you said, actually, they may well have the skills that they need. And it's almost being, as much as you can be, open-minded about the way you write an advert.
Absolutely, yeah. And no more is that so important than when today we look at the advent of digital skills, for example. Yeah. It doesn't matter where you've developed those digital skills. You should be able to take them elsewhere. So all companies are doing is a disservice to themselves if they demand this sector-specific experience. It's unnecessary. Actually, companies should be recruiting more for potential.
I love this, and I couldn't agree more, by the way, with that. Just before we come on to AC, can we just go back to the oil and gas bit? Because you said that you'd built up a really good brand for yourself. And I'm really fascinated by this. I think people that listen to this, they're listening in probably because they want to think about their careers, how they can move forward. How did you do that? How did you build up that brand for yourself?
I had to build the trust of my stakeholders. So I mentioned I was never the engineer. I was never the physician. And I needed to really demonstrate success through taking a different view on what they were trying to do and package it up in a different way. And it was just over a number of years, getting successful traction with government, being invited to roundtables with ministers, getting changes in policy, that then allowed the companies that I was representing to invest in a different way, or to grow, or to raise their positive profile. So, you have to build up a kind of track record of successes. There's no good saying my different approach is different and you'll never understand it. You need to have that kind of complementary relationship with the specialist, as it were.
No, totally get it.
And there's an interdependency. So part of building the brand is realising, again, that you're coming into work in partnership. You need them as much as they need you. And I think it's that over time, examples start to show actually the output is all the more valuable because we've worked differently together.
It's really interesting, as I've had the joy of interviewing people doing this, that idea of actually, I found most of the people that I've interviewed have been very much like you are, working in partnership. That's huge, that they have given, but they've also received. And I think it's how much that network counts and how much not only you put forward, but actually you get a lot from it and you can learn, which I think's wonderful. Fast forward now to your time as CEO of ACE. Tell me more about the role that you're doing now.
Okay, so we represent the built environment sector, about 400 members, different types of member, large multinationals right through to small kind of, one-person setups. So we do a number of things. We, first of all, lobby on behalf of the sector. So we take the sector's wants and wish list to government to demonstrate, what's the quid pro quo here? Government, if you can do this, we can do that. So we seek to kind of unlock potential in the sector through good policy, a strong business environment here in the UK. We also provide a learning platform. I think that's really key. So we offer the chance for companies to come together on topics such as diversity and inclusion and share good practice. So one of the things we've recently launched is a People First Charter, which is all about this idea of the individual that's working in the sector is actually the priority, because that is your highest capital asset, as it were. So making sure that people feel motivated, making sure that people feel part of their organisation, listened to, invested in, and able to grow and succeed and recognised. So these industry level initiatives don't happen unless you have a convening platform. So that's what ACE really presents itself as.
And I want to just pick up on that DE&I point that you just made, because probably same for you, not a day goes by that I'm not asked by some employer organisation that will say, please can you help us to achieve better DEI, DIB, whatever they refer to it as. And they know what they want to achieve. They know why they want to achieve it. What they struggle with is the how. It's almost, what practical steps can I take? I'm kind of feeling like you probably get asked very similar questions. So how do you answer that? What advice can you give?
Don't recruit people that are like you, I think is one thing. I think companies fall into a terrible trap of recruiting the same. Diversity is all about having that kind of multitude of views in a team, be that the types of individuals, the backgrounds, protected characteristics, all of that makes for a much stronger recipe. And I think the more we promote that, the better, quite frankly. I talked a little bit about job descriptions and this kind of, must have 20 years experience. I think it's great to see that starting to disappear. But again, I think still a lot of work could be done on how companies present themselves. When you talk about infrastructure and construction, your mind might be drawn to, this image of, a guy in a hard hat, overalls and a spanner in his hand. Yeah. How that's increasingly not the case. I'm not sure it ever has been. I think that's one tiny part of the sector. The kind of plethora of different types of jobs that people can have that are very accessible to many audiences. I think we need to promote that a lot more and change the vocabulary as how we talk about construction and infrastructure. Things like digital, things like the new technology that's coming on. Anybody, from any persuasion, any audience can be part of that, can have a very exciting, successful career. And I think as the world changes, the skill sets that perhaps were needed previously, or companies thought they need previously, are also changing. So somebody that studied Spanish at university and not engineering can be just as good a project manager in your company, and potentially better. So again, it's that need for open-mindedness. It's not this kind of, looking at this kind of template of skills that, these people must have. It's this idea of actually, let's just think this through. Where has that background enabled them to perform in this context? It's just thinking beyond the kind of, the square box, I suppose.
So I noticed when I was researching your bio that you are a non-exec director. And I know a lot of people, again, ask me when they're thinking about their careers and what to do next, often say, I'm thinking about becoming a non-exec director. They're not really sure how to get those roles, what exactly it involves. Can you explain a little bit about both of those, how and also the what?
Yeah. So I'm a non-executive director of APITO, which is the skills body for the energy sector. So it develops standards for the energy sector. So how did I get involved with APITO? So it was when I was working in the oil and gas sector. And as we've discussed, I kind of had built quite a profile there. And so when I was leaving, a lot of people were like, how could you be leaving this sector? We'd really like your skills still to be retained somehow. Would you be interested in becoming a non-exec director of APITO? To which I said yes. And actually, I thought, is this going to be a massive drain on my time as I'm trying to, work in a new sector, get up to speed with all of the policy issues that my new members have? But actually it's been brilliant because it's given me a different perspective on how governance works. So when I prepare for my own board meetings, I reflect on, if I'm a board member, which I am of APITO, how do I want things put to me? How do I want pre-reads put together? What kinds of decisions and what kinds of data and evidence do I need to feel comfortable in fulfilling my fiduciary duties? So it's really enabled me to have that different kind of viewpoint on how you manage a board.
I love this because, again, it's this circling back. You always think in these roles, what can I do for them? But in the end, you learn so much yourself. It goes both ways so much. That is really useful to know that, because I know that people are very interested in that. I also noticed from your bio that you've done an MBA, which seems to be a common theme with quite a few people that I interview. What did you take away from it?
How to run a business. I think that was, the primary objective for me. So I was very good at the comms, I was very good at the marketing, but I couldn't read a balance sheet. I wasn't very good with figures. So for me, it was just filling in all of those kind of imperative skills that you need in order to run, again, any business. So that's really what I took away from that. I think also the networking side of an MBA is really important. You meet swathes of people from very different industries, very different cultures, different countries. It's fascinating, and you can take that network way beyond the end of the course. And I do. I mean, we have meetups and we share information. I've got colleagues that work in Apple, which I would never have had before. So it's really just enriched my network.
That's that. And I think, again, having a great network that you can continue to learn from, and that continuous learning beyond the end of an academic course is so important, isn't it? And having people that you can go to if you want to bounce an idea off, that it's actually sometimes really refreshing to have a completely different outlook from yours.
Yeah, and I would say also that one of the things of being a chief exec, it can be quite lonely. Yeah. So your network is so important. And the MBA was definitely one way that I, created that network that I do very much rely on. If I have a challenge or a challenging situation, I'm not quite sure, which way to turn, I'll speak to somebody from that network, and, you get a very interesting perspective on the topic.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Sometimes it helps to have someone who's not emotionally invested, who has complete perspective, who is there for you. They're only saying it genuinely for you, with your best interest, and that's the advice that that you can really listen to and take and then action. Absolutely. So, last question. people are fascinated by people like yourself that are incredibly successful, they've got to the top of their game. If you were to pass a wisdom on as to what you think has made you so successful, what do you think that is?
So I would say it's focusing on what's different about me and turning that into a strength. So the ED&I side, the being in a context where I'm not the specialist, it's being the translator, it's honing what's different about me and using that as a skill to propel me forward. And I would suggest and encourage people to reflect on that. Don't try and emulate, try to be different, and try to then explain what your differences are in order to package that as your selling point, your USP to take you forward in your career.
I love that.
And have confidence.
I love that. I love that difference can be a differentiator, because I think a lot of people can think they need to fit in and almost make themselves smaller and be the same as everybody else. But I love that you're advocating for difference to be the differentiator, which I think is going to be quite heartwarming for a lot of people, actually. So thank you so much for that. I think for me, I've learned a lot about, I think the continuous learning has come through, and then the importance of the network. But most of all, I think it will be I think this will resonate for a lot of people, is those changes you've made and really looking to the skills that you have, as opposed to getting hung up about the amount of experience you might have. But I also think it would resonate to any employers who are listening to be open-minded, because if they want to achieve diversity, it does mean looking outside of perhaps the normal box that you normally look to when you're looking to recruit. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to everybody else for listening in or watching this today. You can look for other episodes on YouTube, on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you normally get your normal podcasts.